Hola,
Hello.
¿cómo estás?
Muy bien, ¿y tú?
Bien. How have you been?
uh, I've been pretty good. Do you speak any other languages?
I speak French. I speak very bad Spanish. I speak much better French. You?
I speak very bad Spanish. I should speak better. I'm Colombian. My
Yeah.
mom was born in Colombia, but my dad was born in Israel. So I didn't speak it growing up a ton. And I don't know any Hebrew,
Hmm.
but so I'm a disappointment to both of my sides of the family.
Yeah.
But
I've
yeah,
been paying
so
taxes. Been paying
you've been paying
taxes
taxes.
and yeah, I'm on my third round of keto. So I'll take a month off keto and then I'll spend a week. I'll take a month on keto and then a week off keto. And so I'm on my third round. So I've gone 2 months already on keto. I took a week off. Now I'm starting keto again this week. Um, so mostly been chilling. And the topic today is the rise of Rome. Um,
Yes. So
and
we go for it.
My plan as of now is to split the Romans into four episodes. You have the rise of Rome, which is the rise of the Roman Republic from being a small town in central Italy to complete dominance of the known world. Then there's the fall of the Roman Republic, and then the Roman Empire, and we've already done the fall of Rome. And then we'll probably do future episodes of the Byzantines. Rome was a big thing. It did a lot, so there's a lot to talk about with Rome. And the where I'll start is that the world the Romans came to dominate was a world where the Greeks had been going on for several centuries. And the Romans and the Greeks I classify them as the same civilization. And the reason I say that is that they worshipped very similar gods, they had very similar economic systems, they saw themselves as the same civilization. Um, and they use similar architecture, similar philosophy, but they're different people. Where Rome is in Italy, it's in the middle of Italy, and the Greeks, for centuries beforehand, they had done a lot. And so they had built colonial possessions in France, in southern Italy, in Turkey, in Ukraine. And the Greeks had a massive innovation in literally everything. They built modern philosophy, architecture, drama, military advances. The Greeks were incredible. And it's comparable to the Europeans over the last 500 years. And there's this whole theory of civilizational cycles of history where you can look at previous civilizational cycles to predict what other civilizations are like. And there are definitely patterns where the easiest comparison is the Greeks to the colonial Europeans, where the Europeans had all this technological and social and philosophic innovation. The Europeans and the Greek colonized around the world had these giant colonial empires where we really need to do an Alexander the Great episode because he's one of the most impressive figures, where this teenage Greek leader conquered everything out to India. He conquered the Persian Empire. And so the eastern part of that whole area of the world were Greek colonies. And at the same time, though, the Greeks had been eroding their cultural institutions. And so the Greeks, they had grown decadent, they had grown weak, they had grown corrupt. The Greeks were mired in all these civil wars between them. And so Greek civilization was in decline. But by that point, the Greeks had transmitted a lot of their civilization to Italy, where the Greeks had all these colonies in southern Italy, in Sicily, and the area around the Italian boot. And there were actually more Greeks in Italy than there were Greeks in Greece itself. And the Greeks in Italy were wealthier. But then the Romans, who started out as this tiny city state in central Italy, they were able to imbibe this Greek civilization into a lot of their culture, even though they were a culturally distinct people.
And so where should we start in terms of the story?
Sorry. Yeah, so the Romans are a Latin people. And Latin has since become a giant cultural designation, whether in South America or France. But the Latin started out as this tiny area the size of New Jersey in central Italy. And um, Rome was supposedly founded in 753 BC by Romulus and Remus. And we since think that this is basically political propaganda where we don't think there ever was a Romulus and Remus. But the Romans had this myth that they were the descendants of the Trojans, where a lot of you might have heard of the story of the Trojan War with heroes like Odysseus and Agamemnon and that stuff. And the Romans believed that the Trojans lost that war, which was around 1200 BC. So that's 500 years before the foundation of Rome was supposedly going to happen. And then the Trojans fled to Italy and made Rome. And that might sound silly, but from genetic and cultural evidence, the Etruscans, who were the big power of central Italy, north of Rome in Tuscany, the Etruscans are around Florence and the Romans are further south around Rome. The Etruscans have a language and genetics from Turkey. So there might be some underlying truth there. And so if you want to look at the map of Italy around 500 BC, which was when Rome was still a small place, there were Celts in the north of Italy. And the Celts were a warrior people who we'll hear more about. And this is my Celtic broadsword, where we're moving out of time periods I collect weapons in, but this is the kind of swords the Celts would use. And at the time of the rise of Rome, swords were a lot shorter because their steel technology wasn't as good. And for a lot of the other swords you'll see in previous videos, they're a lot longer because steel technology improved. And this was the golden age of the Celts. And I'm Irish and Scottish and stuff. And so I'm a Celt. And now the Celts have been pushed out to the fringes of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, the northwest of France, Wales. But back then, the Celts were a really powerful and important people who went from Ireland to Turkey and from Spain to Poland. They had most of Europe. And they had the north of Italy. And Rome actually formed to fight off the Celts, where there's this theory developed by Peter Turchin that empires form due to being on the frontier with another ethnically distinct, strong people. And so the Mongols formed at the border with the Chinese, the Americans formed fighting against the Native Americans, and the Romans formed because the north of Italy was controlled by the Celts, and the Celts were militarily powerful. They charged down Italy, and the Celts nearly burned down the city of Rome in the 5th century BC. And the Romans only barely survived. And it makes you wonder what would have happened if Rome got destroyed. Because Rome became this great player, but the thing is, whenever you look at countries that could become great empires in the future, there was always a point when they were weak. And so Rome, as it started, was this tiny horse trading town on the Tiber River. And the Latins were, I'm going to put a map up. The Latins were a tiny tribal confederacy in central Italy. North of them were the Etruscans. We spoke of the Etruscans before, where they were this ethnically very distinct group from Turkey that created this empire in central Italy. And the Etruscans were very advanced. The Romans like to portray them as barbarians, but for the first few centuries, the Etruscans were vastly more advanced than the Romans. And the Romans got a lot of culture from the Etruscans. And so Celts in the north, the Etruscans controlled Rome. And then beneath Rome were the Samnites, who were another Italian tribal people, and then the Greeks. And so Italy at this time period was not a super important place, except for the Greek areas in the south that were very wealthy and powerful. And it was this squabbling confederacy. And so, like America, and over the course of this podcast, I'm going to compare Rome to America a lot because there's a lot of incredible similarities. But Rome was a colonial possession of another empire, being a monarchy of the Etruscans. And what happened was that the Roman noble families rebelled against the Etruscans, kind of like America's founding fathers, and they drove out the kings. And Rome became an aristocratic monarchy where they had a mixed constitution, and the Romans venerated their constitution tremendously. They worshipped it, and breaking the constitution was seen as a massive social taboo that the Romans held onto for centuries. But the Constitution was drafted by the Roman nobility, and the Romans had your amount of votes based off your social class. So the very most elite nobility had a vastly disproportionate amount of votes. And Rome started out as a system where the upper classes could vote. And then over time, they gradually gave the lower classes greater amounts of the voting. But Rome, for its entire history, was dominated by these clans, like the Scipii and the Julii and the Brutii. And a really cool video game that I'm sure a lot of you have played is called Rome Total War. And it's a strategy video game where the Romans have to conquer the known world. And the interesting thing the game does is it doesn't have a single Roman faction, but it splits the Romans into these families, like as I said before, the Julii or the Scipii. And the thing is that Rome was not an individualistic society. Like in America or Europe, like as an American, you are not, families are incredibly weak in America. And so for most of history, and this included the Romans and the Greeks, your parents arranged a marriage. You lived in a family compound with your entire extended family for your whole life. Your family determined how you worked, and the family was the basic economic unit. So rather than having corporations, you had these very strong clans and families that would accumulate resources. And Rome was dominated by these various clans, and Rome actually did have social mobility. If you were a poor or a talented Roman, you could rise up in higher social status. And so there were lower class Romans that rose to dominance. But in general, the Romans had these clans that would dominate power, and they would guide the nation. And so in this video game, although it is an abstraction, it is reasonable to have these giant families be the ones who do the conquering. And so Rome was run by its nobility during the Republican period. And the Roman nobility were known for being incredibly brave and competent and self-sacrificing. And Rome went through a couple different class wars. And class struggle was one of the worst things that happened to the classical world. The classical world is what I call the Greeks and the Romans. And in all of the Greeks and the Roman states, there were these literal wars between the upper and lower classes. And interestingly, Greece actually had communist revolutions. And this is a tangent, but one of my favorite lines from history is there was a play about the communist rebels in Greece where they said, hey, we should hold all of our possessions in common and no one should work. And then the person in the playwright said, hey, or the character the playwright wrote said, who's going to work then? And then the communist said, the slaves, of course. And that's indicative of the social structure of the Greeks and the Romans, where the ruling class were slave owners among the Greeks and the Romans, and that wasn't as big an issue earlier on in the Roman Republic because the Romans were too poor to own a lot of slaves. But as Rome built its empire and it became wealthier, and we'll talk about this more in our episode in the fall of the Roman Republic, the upper classes started to own vast amounts of slaves, and that destroyed the social foundations of Roman culture because middle-class labor couldn't compete with the slave owners. But for the period we're talking about, that wasn't really a big issue. Rome in this time period was a middle-class nation, and the upper classes generally served the interests of the rest of the population. And what happened with these wars between the lower and the upper classes is the Romans established various social institutions where the upper and lower classes were represented in their democracy. And so Rome became an exceptionally socially cohesive society. And if you look back upon the Romans, the thing that really made sure that they got their empire, or the two things, were their social cohesion and their ability to assimilate and work with other people, where the Romans were incredibly tough, they were incredibly cohesive, they were incredibly self-sacrificing for their nation. And you know about the Japanese in World War II with kamikaze fighters and that stuff?
Yep.
I'm researching a Japanese civilization video. So I've read like 6 books in Japan, and there's actually a lot of similarities between Japanese and Roman culture. And one of them is just the sheer self-sacrifice and courage that the Romans had, like which is what the Japanese had in World War II, where a great story is, and we'll talk about these wars later, in Rome's wars with Carthage, one of the Roman nobility was being sent over to Tunisia to deal with the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians said, you need to go back to Rome, get us a peace treaty with Rome, and if you don't do that, we will torture you to death. And he said, I agree to that deal. He went back to Rome, told the Romans, hey, you need to beat the Carthaginians because we're going to, for the Roman nation, this would be a great time for us to not stop the war. Then he could have not done this, but his honor was so great. He went back to Carthage and then had them torture him to death so that he wouldn't break his word. And Rome in this time period, like, that shows the degree of absurd moralism and vigor of the Roman nation. The Romans at this point were an incredibly religious, moralistic, brave, honorable people. And that came from the intense social cohesion inside Rome between the social classes, where everyone in Rome had intense loyalty to the city of Rome. And so across the entire social structure, people were willing to die and sacrifice themselves for the nation. And the Romans were the most brave and patriotic people of anyone in the known world. So if you were fighting the Romans, you knew that your people would not fight with the same courage that the Romans did.
Should I ask questions now, or do you want to keep
No, you
going?
can ask questions.
Yeah.
I'm just drinking my tea.
That's an amazing glass. The
Thanks.
I want to go back to something earlier you said around how the Greeks sort of fell because they became decadent as well. Does that seem to be a common pattern here, or why don't we sort of compare sort of the Greeks and the Romans a bit?
Every society turns decadent. It's a natural historic process, and I think it's useful to view history as partly a biological process where you do have free will, but you see these same patterns happen again and again. And the strongest, most vigorous, most honorable peoples will fall into decadence. And it happens to all the great empires. It happened to the Mongols, the Romans, the British. It's happening to the Americans now. And the thing is, there's this cyclic form where it's the whole bad times create strong men who create good times who create weak men, and the cycle restarts. And that theory of history gets mocked a lot, but you can definitely see it over history. And every single society goes to decadence. And depending on how the social structure of a society works, that can either take 120 years or 260 years. And so look at Hollywood. Hollywood's a great example. Hollywood has gone through the exact same process of decadence that you would see in the Middle Eastern Empire, because if your society is a polygamous society will hit decadence at twice the speed of a monogamous society. And the Romans were monogamous, which was one of the big reasons for their success. But the Hollywood was made in 1900. 120 years later, Hollywood is decadent. And decadence is when your society, you lose a moral code. The upper classes oppress the lower classes. You lose any intellectual honesty. You lose the ability to be creative or fight in wars. It's just your society is consumed by degeneracy and gluttony. And that's happened to Hollywood, which is why we're making Terminator 13. And why, it's why YouTube is gradually replacing Hollywood. As you can see this in an industry, and you could probably draw a bunch of other parallels to other industries. But so the Greeks, they had their golden age and they went decadent. And so everything that I said beforehand about styles of decadence were issues the Greeks had. And it's interesting, whereas the Romans conquered Greece, they had immense respect for the artistic and philosophic abilities of the Greeks, but they viewed the Greeks similar to how Europeans view Americans view Europeans, where Americans view Europeans as you guys aren't manly, you don't make anything, you don't invent anything, you're just you have socialism that destroys your innovative ability. you build these philosophies that are just rent seeking, and you build these philosophies of intellectual masturbation. And so everything we say about the Europeans were things the Romans said about the Greeks. And um, and Greece was actually socialist, which was interesting, where Greece had a socialist economic system and Rome had a capitalist libertarian economic system. And so that was a big reason the Romans were able to. It's depressing where the Greeks were originally known as a very brave and intrepid and exploratory people. I mean, they got to friggin' India. They had Greek kingdoms in Afghanistan and Spain. But then by the time the Romans idolized the Greeks and viewed them with tremendous respect. So we'll talk about later the Roman conquest of Greeks. The Romans invaded Greece and they're like, we love the Greeks. They're the people who made our culture. And then over time, they saw the Greeks stop being able to function as a society. And so an interesting thing that we'll get to later is that the Romans gave the Greeks differing levels of self-governance, where it's like the European Union. The Americans liberated Europe. And then the Americans made the European Union because we wanted to give the Europeans self-governance. But then what would happen in a situation like the Romans and the Greeks is the European Union loses the ability to function and collapses. And then the Americans would keep on making different iterations of the European Union where the Americans would have more power. And so by European Union round 3 or 4, it's basically an American colony.
Before we get to the conquest, let's really flesh out what exactly the Romans took from Greeks. You say that, hey, they made our culture. Yeah. Why don't you flesh that out?
So the Romans were not an inventive people culturally. And so we view the Roman Empire with these rose-tinted glasses as the apex of civilization. And that's partly true. The Romans were incredibly advanced in organization and in architecture. And so we respect the Romans so much because the Romans leave these just absurd architectural constructions. And if you go to Europe, it's insane where the Roman roads are still there. The Romans built these roads 2,000 years ago. You can still drive a cart over them. Until the 19th century, European governments preferred to use Roman roads than their current roads. And so the Romans were absurdly advanced in a couple things. But then we've kind of over-glorified the Roman Empire, where if you compare the Middle Ages to the Romans, the Middle Ages was more advanced militarily, in mechanical ability, in science, in philosophy, in a bunch of different things. And so it's kind of like when you look at the history of philosophy, you're looking at Europeans. There are very few good American philosophers. And it's comparable where the Greeks and the Europeans established the philosophy, the art, the culture, the poetry, all that stuff. And then the Americans and the Romans have taken these European forms and not really innovated upon them. So the Romans were not a culturally inventive people. In this kind of the same way the Americans are, where the Americans, you don't hear about the Americans developing new philosophy or new artistic trends. We are here to invent technology. That's what technology and economics. Those are the things that we're really good at. And the Romans were comparable. And so after the Romans conquered Greece, they took a tremendous amount of Greek slaves. But the Greeks were very intelligent and cultured. And so the ironic thing is the Romans would have high status slaves. So the Romans would have slaves who were the teachers to their students. They'd have slaves who were their accountants, who were philosophers. And being a slave in the Roman Empire wasn't like being a slave in America, where all the slaves in America picked cotton or they fixed carts. In Rome, you could be a very wealthy slave, where your master lets you live in a mansion because you're doing a valuable service for him. And so that was the Greeks. And so as the Romans took in Greek culture, there was this moral panic inside Rome where the Romans thought, okay, the Greeks are degenerate, they're socialist, they're atheist. Once we take in Greek culture, we ourselves will become degenerate socialists and atheists. You can see a lot of parallels to America and Europe's relationship again. And that is what happened. I'm not going to just blame the Greeks because the Romans they became so ludicrously wealthy that they stopped having moral standards. And so Rome became this vastly unequal unfree slaveocracy. Yeah.
Yeah. The and continue again before going to the so we outlined the contributions that the Greeks have made. Why don't we outline the
Yeah.
contributions or the innovations that the Roman made that future society civilizations
Yeah.
would take from Rome?
So the Greeks created the cultural form that the Romans made, and then the Romans expanded that really rapidly. And we're going to get to this more in the future episodes on Rome, but the Romans eventually conquered an empire that stretched from Scotland to Arabia. And so the Greeks, the Greeks were talented adventurers and talented inventors and philosophers. The Romans were talented administrators and governors. And so the Romans created this giant civilization that stretched across a truly vast area. And the Romans created centuries of peace, which created this era of incredible wealth and stability and order. And so the Romans took these Greek ideas, spread them across a vast area, and then maintained them for centuries. And so we take a lot of things from the Greeks. We are a Western European diaspora country. The only reason the English or the French or the Germans have these Greek ideas is due to the Roman Empire. And the biggest thing the Romans have done that lasted forever was law, where the Romans constructed the legal code that most of the world uses today. The English-speaking world uses English common law, which is under a completely different logic, but most of the world today still uses Roman law. And so the Romans, and the Roman military was absurdly advanced. The Roman military, it could probably still defeat its enemies thousands of years later. And the Romans were the best at creating an army. And the period we're talking about, the Romans actually didn't have a military advantage over their enemies. But at the end of this period we're going to talk about, in the start of the fall of the Roman Republic, the Romans made these vast military advances that just gave them an absolutely incredible army. And armies for thousands of years afterwards were taking ideas from the Romans, where there was a big military breakthrough in the 1500s with the invention of drill. And drill is this, it's basically marching in ranks so that you can, an entire body of men marching at the exact same time and splitting in the shapes. And this was a massive breakthrough that completely changed European warfare in the 15 and 1600s, but they were just taking an idea from the Romans. So the Romans were doing drill for thousands of years before the modern Europeans did, but reinventing this old Roman technique was one of the biggest breakthroughs in European warfare.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you think about the legacy of Rome, what do people argue about, or where do you think that's underappreciated or overappreciated, or what do people get incorrect?
There's not that much dissent or disagreement on this part of Roman history. We talked about the fall of Rome, which is more controversial, but the good thing about ancient history is politics don't really play much into it. Like for modern history, it's the right and the left are arguing with each other over, oh my God, blank, blank, blank. No one really cares for this. And the great thing about ancient history is it's written and explained by these mega nerds who just want to tell the truth. And there's not really a political agenda to change it. And so this era of Roman history, there's a generally pretty agreed upon historical narrative to it.
But isn't there some controversy? Like my understanding that there's this right wing anon thinker writer called Bronze Age Pervert, and he wrote his college thesis, I believe, on sort of the Greeks and slavery and maybe how they were was it I can't remember who, but basically like advocating for slavery.
Yeah, so that is a philosophic school. It mostly died out in the 19th century. And the thing is, like, there is no political left in this topic. The people who talk about this for a political agenda are on the right, because the story here is a fundamentally right-wing story of this growing country taking in socialism and foreign ideas, and then those foreign ideas corrupted it. And when the left did write out this topic, they were writing it through the lens of class oppression. I think the right and the left's narratives here are both valid, but frankly, we're not a historically smart enough society to use this in discourse. Most of this discourse was 100 years ago. And so the left said that slavery and class oppression is what killed Rome. I think that's totally fair. Having studied that time period, I think slavery is the biggest thing which killed the Roman social structure. But again, we're going into stuff for the fall of the Roman Republic video. And for the right, so the right and the left were both right about, they were both right about foreign degeneracy and class oppression being the things that killed the Roman Republic. And I have a book back there called Roll, Jordan, Roll, and I talked about it in our Civil War video, where the Confederacy and the slaveholders of the South, and for the Atlantic slave trade, their big justification for slavery was that the Greeks and the Romans did it. The Greeks and the Romans were an amazing civilization, so slavery is fine.
Yeah. Interesting. The other thing we mentioned earlier is you mentioned Rome was a aristocratic monarchy.
Yeah.
What was the thought about how was democracy viewed at this time? Right? Didn't the Athenians have some experiments in democracy? Like, what do people think about democracy?
So, the Athenians had democracy, and that died out 200 years earlier, where Athens was only democracy for a little over a century, and then the Romans had all these the Greeks had all these dictators, and so Rome felt a monarchy and dictatorship. And democracies were not popular. Aristotle, who was the biggest philosopher of that era, and in this time period, everyone agreed Aristotle was basically God. You weren't allowed to contradict Aristotle. Aristotle said that monarchy is the best political system because democracy promotes demagogues and crowd pleasing. And so the Greeks stopped having democracy. The Romans did have a democracy, though. And there was a Greek writer named Polybius who was involved in this time period of the rise of the Roman Republic. And Polybius said that a big reason the Romans were so successful was because they were a democracy, while the Greeks became monarchies, because it meant the Romans could pull more loyalty from their followers. In the same way for England, where they did analyses of early modern England, and the English could actually raise higher taxes and higher social cohesion among their population because England was a republic. Well, so if you have a republic, you can demand more from the people in the republic because it's ruled by the people, and so it represents them. But to go back to the rise of Rome itself, Rome defeated the Etruscans. It conquered central Italy into this confederacy. And the Romans created a federated republic where the Romans had all these allies around Italy. And the Romans gradually conquered Italy, fighting long wars with the Samnite peoples of South Italy. And the Rome, and this had issues in the Republican period later, or the fall of the Roman Republic, that Rome, there was the city of Rome, and then you had all these allied states. And the allied states would fight for the Romans and sacrifice their lives to them. But over time, the issue was that the city of Rome itself was making all the decisions, and the allied peoples didn't like that. And so there was this civil war later on where the allied peoples they fought a civil war against the Romans so that they could get political representation because this one city-state was dictating the entirety of Italy. But in the period we're talking about, the Roman allied states loved the Romans and fought incredibly loyally for them. And so in the Punic Wars, which we'll get to soon, the Carthaginians tried to get the Roman allied states to rebel against them, and only one out of dozens of the allied states did rebel against the Romans. And a big thing that made the Romans so successful is that for the Greek city-states, the problem was you couldn't get these city-states to ally together due to so complicated religious and social structure issues. But the thing the Romans did a breakthrough on was that they created a political system where they could unify. There's a really complicated argument I'm not going to get into here. They were able to unify the religious and political systems of all the city-states. And the reasons the Romans won was they were the people who were able to get the other states to fight with them. So it was this an alliance of city-states, while for the Greeks, it was one city-state oppressing the other city-states. And so the Romans have taken peninsular Italy, everything south of modern Milan, which was still Celtic, down to the bottom of the boot of Italy. And then the Romans started butting heads with the Greeks, who are a much wealthier and more advanced civilization. And Uh, Pyrrhus of Epirus Epirus is a Greek kingdom in modern Albania. He was one of the greatest generals of his time. He invaded Italy, and this is where we get the term Pyrrhic victory, where Pyrrhic victory means a victory so painful it's not worth winning. Because Pyrrhus of Epirus would fight the Romans, and he was a brilliant commander. But the Romans, and this is the biggest reason the Romans won, they could just keep throwing armies at Pyrrhus. So Pyrrhus would win these battles, but he ran out of men. And so even though Pyrrhus technically won the battles, the Romans won the campaign through just because the Romans had such a large coalition of city-states. Right? The Romans just had more men than anyone else. And the Romans weren't militarily more advanced than their opponents in this time period. So the Romans, most ancient societies could only lose one or two battles and survive. Even the Persian Empire, which is the length longer than the current United States and in tens of millions of people, Alexander was able to wipe out the Persian Empire in two battles. But the Romans, in the wars against the Carthaginians or Pyrrhus, the Romans lost four battles where they lost 50,000 men each. And Rome had a population of 5 million people. So in the Punic Wars, which we'll get to later, the Romans lost a majority of their male upper class, and they kept fighting because the Romans had such loyalty among their people, and they were willing to take casualties. And so the Romans took out the Greek city-states in southern Italy, or Magna Graeca, and they started butting heads with the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians are their own completely different civilization on a totally different trajectory. They were originally from Lebanon, and then the Lebanese Phoenicians, who were the biggest traders of the ancient world, and they had colonies out in Spain and North Africa, their colony in Tunisia broke off and became its own city-state. And Carthage was also a republic, which people forget. So it was these two republics, the Carthaginians and the Romans, fighting each other. And the Carthaginians had colonies in Sicily. They controlled the western half of Sicily. They controlled Corsica and Sardinia, or islands off the coast of Italy. They had colonies in Algeria and Morocco and Spain. So Carthage was this successful colonial empire. And the Romans started butting heads with the Carthaginians in Sicily because it's actually pretty similar. There's a lot of parallels between the Punic Wars and the World Wars, where the Romans were helping this Greek city-state in Sicily, which is an island off the south coast of Italy. And then this tiny conflict in Sicily spiraled off into a war between the Carthaginians and the Romans. And the Carthaginians hadn't meddled with the Romans for a long time while Rome was concentrating in Italy, because the Romans and the Carthaginians signed a treaty saying, Rome, you can take anything on Italy. Carthage will take everything in the ocean. And Carthage was this naval trading empire run by the merchants. And so the Carthaginians had the best navy in the world. And this is just like the ultimate Chad move the Romans pulled, because the Romans didn't have a navy. They had never had a navy. They made a navy from scratch with no knowledge of it. They crashed their first navy because they didn't know how to sail, so 20,000 of their men died. They immediately built another navy next year, and they invented a new military technology called the crow, where it's a drawbridge, where they dropped the drawbridge on the Carthaginians, and then they could move, because the Romans had better soldiers than the Carthaginians. Or the Romans were better at hand-to-hand fighting than the Carthaginians. So they dropped the crow on other enemy ships. And so the Romans, who had no idea how to sail right beforehand, wiped out the entire Carthaginian navy on their first try. And then this was just humiliating because the Carthaginians were supposed to have the best navy in the world. And so at the first Punic Wars, the Romans took Sicily and the other islands off the coast of Italy, like Corsica and Sardinia, and forced the Carthaginians to make this treaty with the Romans where they gave the Romans vast amounts of money. And it's comparable to the First World War, where the Germans were forced to pay these reparation treaties to the Romans. The Germans were forced to pay these reparation treaties to the Allies, which in turn built up resentment for both the Second World War and the Second Punic War. And before I go to the Second Punic War, do you have any questions?
No, let's dive in. It's great.
Okay, so Second Punic War, Carthage was run by this parliament of the merchant classes, and then there was the Barcid family, and the Barcids were basically military dictators of the Carthaginian colony in Spain. And so the Barcid military dictator family did not get along with the Carthaginian parliament, but they were the same country. And so the Barcids, Hannibal Barca was the son of Hamilcar Barca. And Hamilcar was a commander who lost in the Punic Wars. And so he told his son at age 7, my son, I need you to kill the Romans. And so Hannibal developed this entire personality of having to crush the Romans. And so he built up this colonial empire in Spain where the Barca family they doubled the Spanish colonies of the Carthaginians. And he built up this army against the Romans. And the Carthaginians were incredibly resentful against the Romans for beating them. And since the Roman Navy had beaten the Carthaginian navy, Hannibal realized he would have to attack Rome overland. And so the Carthaginians declared war on the Romans to get revenge. And Hannibal did this absolutely incredible move where he marched his armies across Spain, France, and over the top of Italy. I'll show a map here, but that's a really long walk, especially with the Alps mountains, which are incredibly difficult to cross. And the Romans never thought that Hannibal could cross the Alps because it was just too big and too mountainous to be able. They thought, especially Hannibal's army had elephants. Because remember, the Carthaginians are from North Africa, where you can have elephants. And so this whole idea of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants was just seen as absurd. And Hannibal is one of the greatest military geniuses in history. And it's interesting, look at the Punic Wars. Because at the start of the war, of the first Punic War, you would think that Carthage was the greater power than Rome, because Carthage was more entrenched, it was wealthier. But then by the time you get to the start of the Second Punic War, or in the Second Punic War, you think the Carthaginians had one of the greatest generals in history, and they still lost to Rome. And so Hannibal had these absolutely stunning and brave victories against the Romans, where he slaughtered 3 or 4 Roman armies that outnumbered him 2 or 3 to 1, with the Battle of Lake Trasimene, the Battle of Cannae, and there's a third one I'm forgetting, where Hannibal marched up and down the Italian peninsula. And the thing is, the Romans recruited men from their own Italian city-states. The Carthaginians had this multi-ethnic army of Celts, of North African Berbers, of elephants, Spanish, Tunisians. And Hannibal's big issue was that he could keep winning these battles, but he couldn't keep recruiting new troops. And so his goal was to get the Italian city-states to rebel against Rome, but that just didn't work. And so he was stuck wandering up and down the Italian peninsula. And people say that there was a point where Hannibal could have taken Rome, where he could have marched on Rome. But the problem is Rome had giant walls that Hannibal didn't have, like, the catapults to take. And so Hannibal kept on beating the Romans militarily, but he had no way he could take Rome. And so the war kept stalling for years on end, as Hannibal would wander up and down Italy, defeating any armies the Romans would throw at them, while he couldn't actually beat the Romans. And so it became this nasty war of attrition. And the Punic Wars became the defining moment of Rome's creation, because the Romans remembered the Punic Wars as the point where we nearly got wiped out. And there's the whole question of, what if Carthage did win the Punic Wars? Because then the Roman Empire would be done. Carthage would be the great power. So a majority of the Roman upper class died. And keep in mind, Rome had a population of 6 million people, and they lost millions of that in the Punic Wars. And Hannibal was right outside the city of Rome. And so this was this defining moment where the Romans nearly died, but then it pulled together, and like the World's Wars for us, it became this defining moment of their patriotism and national myth. And the Romans developed this thing called the Fabian strategy, because the Romans had these consuls where the Romans, for their consul or their equivalent to the president, he only ran for a single year. You can only run once. So the Romans had these leaders who would run once, and then they'd have another leader. And so a couple of the consuls, because Hannibal was in Italy for years on end, they wanted to just go out and attack Hannibal. But Hannibal was able to wipe out any armies the Romans threw at him. And so Fabian was a Roman consul who said, we're going to starve out Hannibal, and we're going to try to keep him from taking anything and gradually use guerrilla warfare. And the Fabian strategy worked. It gradually whittling down Hannibal, but the Romans were too proud to keep doing it because the Romans were a very aggressive and manly people who saw using guerrilla warfare as not honorable. And so what happened was the Romans realized they couldn't beat Hannibal in Italy. And another army by Hannibal's brother also marched over Italy. And he could have met up with Hannibal, but then the Romans beat him at the Battle of Metaurus before he could rendezvous with Hannibal. And I think if his brother, I think it was also Hamilcar, if he had reached Hannibal, that the Romans would have lost. But then the Romans realized, we can't beat Hannibal. Let's fight the Carthaginians literally anywhere else. And so Scipio Africanus, or Scipio at the time, he got called Africanus later due to winning the war. Spoilers. But Scipio knocked at the Carthaginian possessions in Spain, which was funding the area where Hannibal was. And then Scipio invaded North Africa itself. And Hannibal couldn't hold on to, he couldn't bring his army from Italy to North Africa. And all of the veterans and the best Carthaginian soldiers were in Italy. So Hannibal had to go back to Africa, create a new army from scratch. And he fought the Romans at the Battle of Zama, and he lost. Hannibal didn't have cavalry, which destroyed his mobility. And the Romans did this really cool tactic where the Carthaginian elephants were charging into the Roman formation. And then the Romans were able to build their formations in a way. So the Carthaginian elephants didn't crush any of them. The Carthaginian elephants ran through them. And then they found a way, I think, to turn the elephants back on the Carthaginians so they could use their own elephants against them. And I always find the use of elephants in these wars to be so badass. But another side tangent, the Romans said they killed a dragon when they were invading Tunisia, and it was this 40-foot snake that the Romans, they were pretty good record keepers. So that means is we know that there was at one point a 40-foot snake that humans killed, which is pretty cool too. But Hannibal's army in Italy was never defeated. The Romans invaded North Africa, which forced the Carthaginians to play their hand. And then the Carthaginians lost the war. They were forced to sacrifice all their colonies and even sacrifice their military ability. And Hannibal fled to the east. And so he went to Greece, he went to Syria, and the Greek kingdoms that were the Greek kingdoms in the east that the Romans went after next. And do you have any questions before I go on to how the Romans followed Hannibal east?
No, because we're getting close to time, and I want to make sure we cover everything. Yeah. So let's get to it.
So the Carthaginians fought against the Macedonians. Carthage and the Romans were fighting each other. At the same time, the Macedonians, which were the big empire in Greece itself, they declared war on the Romans so that they could attack the Romans at the same time as the Carthaginians were. And that would make sense. You'd think that the Carthaginians and the Macedonians working together, they were the two greatest powers of that era besides the Romans. They could beat the Romans, but no, they didn't. And much like World War II, the Romans started to fight a two-front war against the Macedonian Greeks in the east and the Carthaginians. And so Rome got mired in these three wars against the Macedonians, the first, the second, the third Macedonian wars. And they fought the Romans at the Battle of... The Romans beat the Macedonians at the Battle of Pydna and Kynetkephalae. And In those two battles, and I'm simplifying a lot of details here, the Macedonians became corrupt, and there were all these civil wars inside the Macedonians that the Romans worked with. But the Romans were able to use their soldiers to outflank the Greek phalanx, where the Greeks had these pikemen and the spearmen, and the Romans used short swords. And so the Roman short swords had more mobility, so they could surround and kill the Greek spearmen. And this is a big moment in military history because it moved from one paradigm of spear warfare to sword warfare. And for modern people, that might not sound like a big deal, but it is in military history. And so the Romans kept on trying to reinvade Greece to solidify more power, as we said before. And we already spoke of the consequences of the Roman invasion of Greece beforehand. And the big reason was to protect the Greek city-states in southern Greece, like Athens and Sparta, who the Romans saw as their cultural relatives. And they had great respect for them because they invented the democracy the Greeks used. And it's comparable to America protecting Britain and France from Nazi Germany, or the Kaiser in the 20th century. And so over time, the Romans kept on trying to reconquer. They kept on having to reconquer Greece and solidify greater and greater control over it until Greece became a Roman colony. And so the biggest reason the Romans went east to Greece and the Greek-speaking world of the Middle East was to follow Hannibal, because Hannibal kept on fleeing east to these Greek-speaking empires that were Rome's enemies. And so the Greeks conquered Macedonia, and then they invaded the Seleucid Greek-speaking empire that controlled the Middle East in Syria. And these empires looked big on the map, but they were really decadent paper tigers who the Romans could take out easily. And so the Romans finally captured Hannibal in modern Syria, and Hannibal took a potion to kill himself so the Romans couldn't capture him, because the Romans hated that Hannibal had been able to defeat them so many times. And for the final period is that as the Romans were conquering east, they created this humiliating treaty with Carthage, where they forced the Carthaginians to get rid of their military, to pay these horrifying reparations. But the Carthaginians still became wealthy. The Carthaginians were a smart, intrepid people. So even with all these restrictions, the Carthaginians became a wealthy society again, and the Romans became paranoid that the Carthaginians would defeat them and hurt them again. And there was a great Roman politician, or a famous Roman politician called Cato the Elder, who every single speech he gave on no matter what issue, he would end the speech with "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. And so, without provocation, the Romans declared war on Carthage because they were scared it would get too wealthy, and they destroyed Carthage, burning it to the ground, committing genocide against the Punic peoples, or the inhabitants of Carthage, and they spread salt around Carthage so that you could never farm it again. And a couple of centuries later, the Romans rebuilt Carthage with settlement and colonization from Rome. But in Roman philosophy and history afterwards, the defeat of Carthage was seen at the point where Rome went wrong, where the fact they turned on this nation, broke their honor, broke their treaty with Carthage because Carthage was scaring them, was seen for Rome as centuries afterwards as the moment where Rome stopped being a good country because it broke its word and it committed genocide. And this starts the period we'll talk about in a future episode, the fall of the Roman Republic, because Hannibal was said to make the Carthaginian curse. Whereas Hannibal died, he said, as you guys win, your society will die. And that's what happened, where we're at the period now where the Romans had wiped out all their major rivals. They beat the Greeks in the east, they beat the Carthaginians in the west, they had pushed the Celts further north. But then the thing is, as the Romans beat all their rivals and Rome became ludicrously wealthy, it destroyed the Roman social structure, where as the Romans grew wealthier and lost competitors, their society fell apart because there was no reason to cooperate.
That's a great preview to the rise of the fall of the Roman Republic.
Yeah.
But before we leave here, is there anything we haven't gotten to as it relates to the rise of Rome? And
not really.
I'll
give the book recommendations.
Summarize. Yeah, please.
So I forgot to give them for the American Civil War, and I just uploaded the American Civil War video now as we speak. I put them on at the end of my version, but for The early Rome, I'd say that. Actually, let me just pull these books out.
Sure.
So there's not a lot of there's not a lot of good books at the rise of Rome itself, rather than just Roman history. Will Durant's Caesar and Christ is one of the best books you'll read on Rome. Greg Wolfe's History of Rome is also really good. Fustel de Coulanges in the 19th century wrote the best summary of Roman civilization I've seen anywhere and their social structure. And also, I'd recommend reading. Tom Holland has got I think Tom Holland's got a great book on the Punic Wars. I remember reading that, and Dan Carlin has got a really good podcast on the Punic Wars. So I'd recommend this book by Greg Wolfe, Will Durant, Caesar and Christ. Tom Holland wrote a book about this. I'm forgetting the title of, and Fustel de Coulanges and Dan Carlin.
And is there any summarizing worth doing of some of the major points, or is that too complex?
Yeah, the Romans were basically Chads who just crushed everyone else because they had the most determination. But then, as they crushed everyone else, they lost the social structure that made them great in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great tweet length summary. What should we cover next time?
I think I sent you a list before. I said the Spanish Empire.
Yes. Cool. Sounds great. Well, another great episode. We'll look forward to next week's episode, and then also returning back to the fall of Roman Republic soon enough as well.
Yeah. Good time. Peace.
Until next time.